Okay, we're recording and we are good to go.
Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Mary Catherine Waller, and I'm coming to you from the Brain Heart Interconnectome Secretariat Office. And I'm here just to welcome you to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Mahadeo Sukhai. Just to give you some background, we have the pleasure of having Dr. Mahadeo Sukhai, who is the first congenitally blind I can never say it, geneticist, who is a lead in accessibility and anti-ableism in Canada, and particularly in the health and post-secondary education sector. And he is the director or the operations officer of a very interesting organization called Ideas STEM. And he is adjunct professor at Queen's and the Ontario, I think it's called Ontario Tech. And he is also an expert advisor for Accessibility Canada and for the CIHR advisory committee on anti-ableism and accessibility. So over to you, Mahadeo. We're really honored to have you.
Thank you very much, Kate, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here with you to take some time to actually chat with you about modernizing consent and ethics practices in biomedical research. I'm sharing my screen with you. Hopefully, everyone can interact with it. Kate, I'm minimizing your video feed so that I have full clearance of what I'm seeing, so I'm not able to see you or Aisling. So anyhow, I'm going to chat with you today about modernizing research consent and ethics practices. First of all, last week Wednesday is International Day of Persons with Disabilities, December 3rd. Today is International Day of Human Rights, December 10th. On the screen, on sort of the IdeaSTEM purple background, are two logos for IDHR, which all show hands of various hues overlapping one another on the left and raised in the middle. And then the International Day of Persons with Disabilities logo is on the right, which is some more stylized hands kind of interleaved over one another. Last year, the International Science Council issued a declaration on science as a universal human right. You can find the declaration from the ISC at the QR code on the left of your screen. I invite you to scan that and read the declaration. Effectively, it says that every human being has the right to participate in science and has the right to benefit from science. And by participating in science, we also mean participating as research participants, participating as members of research teams. The QR code on the right is actually an editorial that I wrote on behalf of IdeaSTEM for ISC about that declaration. It focuses on education. Um, it doesn't focus on biomedical research. I have to write that editorial still. But it does focus on education. It gives you a sense as to what my thinking is with respect to, and what IdeaSTEM's thinking is with respect to the declaration that ISC issued last year. IdeaSTEM is an organization that positively contributes to a world in which participating in and benefiting from employment, education, and healthcare, particularly through science, technology, engineering, mathematics, is a universal human right grounded in disability justice and inclusive of persons with disabilities. And this also includes participating in and being a part of biomedical and health research. We envision systems transformed by the leadership, knowledge, and creativity of disabled, neurodivergent, mad, and chronically ill persons. We execute this vision using a tripartite mission. We focus on doing science inclusively. We focus on organizational strategy, and we focus on knowledge creation and knowledge generation and knowledge dissemination within the space. Um, And so where this intersects with an entity such as the Brain Heart Interconnectome is we sort of come at the conversation around how do we do inclusive science, how do we train our trainees to do inclusive science, and how do we as an organization actually have a strategy to do just that. I am going to tell you up front the acknowledgements because I find that if we wait until the very end, the acknowledgements never get told. I'm going to acknowledge the funders of the work that I will share with you. This work was funded in two ways by Accessibility Standards Canada and was also funded by the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. Some of the work that's referenced in this presentation was undertaken under my leadership and supervision when I served as CNIB's Vice President Research, and I was the principal investigator on the projects in question. And so I acknowledge the work of CNIB Research as well as the IdeaSTEM team members who contributed to the concepts and findings that are highlighted in this presentation. I will call out specifically Tina Doyle, who works with IdeaSTEM currently, Ainsley Latour, who's IdeaSTEM's co-founder, and Andrew Livingston, who was a member of my team at CNIB Research and is a member of the IdeaSTEM partnership now. I'm going to start this conversation by flagging for you the Disability in Canada statistics for 2022. So there are 8 million adults in Canada over the age of 15 who identify as living with disabilities, according to the 2022 Canadian Survey on Disability. The That number of 8 million represents 27% of the adult population. That is a proportionately higher number by 4.5% compared to the data from 2017, when the number was 6.2 million. The majority of increase is actually within the population of folks aged 15 to 24. And then the majority of increase is actually due to mental health related disabilities, and also seeing disabilities and learning disabilities, and memory disabilities that have all increased proportionately compared to the 2017 numbers, right? So we have 1.8 million extra people in Canada who identify as living with disabilities. Some of that is because of immigration and population growth. Some of that is because more younger folks are identifying. It's because more mental health lived experiences are being recognized through the survey. It's also because, let's be fair, this survey was done during COVID-19, and our perspectives on living with disabilities, the lived experience, and the willingness to be open about one's lived experience during COVID was very different than what it was before. Time will tell. Before anyone offers this pushback, I will kind of summarily offer it myself. Time will tell whether the 2027 numbers will show kind of a rebound toward what the 2017 numbers look like, because we have seen this very strong swing in public attitudes toward inclusion and public attitudes toward disability. We've seen this strong swing away from working from home toward working in the office. We've seen a strong swing away from the positive attitudes toward disability that were evident in 2022 over the last 3 years. So how much that manifests in the CSD in 2027, we'll find out in 2 years, right? But the thing is, that 27% by itself doesn't necessarily talk about everybody and everything. And so the CSD does not actually pay attention to, doesn't actually include folks who have speech communication disabilities. So difficulty verbalizing, right? These are folks who are going to use augmentative communication technology. These are folks who are going to use various forms of assistive technology to communicate. But there are also folks who might sort of identify with multiple lived experiences because they're neurodivergent, or there might be lived experience with physical or flexibility disabilities and so on, right? So that's one group that's not even on this slide. That's on the screen. That's one group that the CSD doesn't pay attention to. The other group the CSD doesn't pay attention to very well is the autistic and neurodivergent community, right? And the estimation of 20% of adults in Canada being neurodivergent is a real number. And we can debate that number, but it is certainly one that's actually out there within the space. And then folks who live with acquired brain injuries is about 4% of the population, and those numbers aren't captured very well within the context of the Canadian Survey on Disability either. So I'm not suggesting that the 27 and the 4 and the 20 don't overlap. I actually rather suspect that they do. But that's actually why I put a question mark and not 51% in the large circle on the right of the screen, because we don't actually know um, how many persons with disabilities there are in Canada, because there's things that the CSD doesn't consider in asking those questions. So the other thing that's worth sort of thinking about is in this conversation is the framing with respect to permanent disabilities, temporary disabilities, and situational disabilities. So you can imagine, for example, let's take seeing, for example. Someone could actually be blind or low vision as a permanent visual condition. Someone could actually live with a cataract in old age, and that today is considered temporary blindness, which I always find entertaining because I was born with congenital cataracts, and so for me it was permanent blindness. And then you can actually have situational conditions like the sun shining on a computer screen that actually have the same functional consequence as vision loss does, but it is a situational thing. And often when we think about disability, when we think about the conversation around disability, we think about that conversation through the permanent disability lens. And so often, particularly in biomedical research, we're going to play the numbers game of, well, how many persons with disabilities are we really talking about in the context of our research? We don't think about temporary, we don't think about situational, and I would actually encourage us to broaden the dialogue just a little bit away from just permanent disabilities. The other thing I think is actually really important to do is to frame the conversation around disability lived experience, because we fully appreciate in many other disciplines that that there's a little bit of nature and a little bit of nurture that actually gives rise to one's lived experience, and we don't often appreciate this in the context of disability, but it's true. The person and the physiology or neurology of the person interacting with their environment, and that environment is changeable. All I have to do is go to a different building and my environment changes. All I have to do is go upstairs to the rest of my house and my environment changes. And because the environment can change, even though I am not as changeable as a person, right? My lived experience will change because the interaction between the person and the environment dictates that lived experience. That's an important realization. The other thing I will actually say is, as a society, we tend to talk about disability through very person-centered, person-autonomous, intrinsic means. And so we think about barriers as personal barriers. We think about disability as a person autonomous thing, and so all the factors that influence disability are intrinsic to me, a person, as opposed to extrinsic to the environment around me. And so there's this large conception of intrinsic factors that sort of define disability and define barrier versus extrinsic factors, systemic factors, environmental factors that can also define disability and barrier, but we don't tend to talk about them nearly as much, right? Also, as a society, we tend to conceive of disability as a health outcome. So I told you I was born with congenital cataracts. I'd never been able to drive a car. Um, and so for me, living as somebody who has a permanent vision loss, never having been able to drive a car, I conceive of my lived experience as more of an identity. On the other hand, the 65-year-old who is developing cataracts, who goes to see their eye doctor, who goes to see a vision loss rehabilitation specialist, the first thing they're going to say is, I want to be able to drive my car again. Help me drive my car, right? And so for many folks, disability, particularly as you age into disability, disability is a health outcome. For others, disability is an identity. And I think the important thing to recognize is that it can be both. But as a society, conceptually, we treat it as if it were one or the other, right? And we tend to zero in on the health outcome side of things. And so now I want to shift away from some of those conceptual pieces to a conversation around disability and human-centered research. So when I say human-centered research, I'm talking about healthcare, public health, biomedical research. Obviously, I'm talking about artificial intelligence research, innovation research, climate change, natural resources, and other forms of research that involve human beings as researchers, participants, or members of governance committees. And so when we talk about disability in human-centered research, we need to talk about disability in the context of researchers being disabled, participants being disabled, members of governance committees being disabled. Today, we have limited representation and diversity in research populations, which often will lead to biased results and limited generalizability. We exclude valuable perspectives and insights from individuals with disabilities, resulting in research that doesn't fully address their needs and experiences. And we often will have inadequate accessibility measures in research protocols, materials, and data collection methods, which will prevent the full participation of persons with disabilities. In addition to that, we also have a lack of consideration for accessibility and assistive technologies, which can hinder individuals with disabilities from fully engaging in the research process. And we have a failure to address the specific challenges and barriers that are faced by persons with disabilities that result in research findings that may not adequately inform inclusive policies and practices. I testified in front of the Standing Committee on Science and Research about EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the assessment of research excellence. And I spoke to some of these things in my remarks. And I'd be happy to actually share that testimony video with the group. It's actually on the Library of Parliament website, and I can send Kate the link. Disability in research, I reinforce this. It is an important aspect of our discourse around research excellence, because when we conduct human-centered research, it's crucial to take into account that very large population of individuals with disabilities that I told you about. And so that will ensure then inclusivity and promote equal participation in research studies. Considering that 27%, that prevalence of disability in Canada, it becomes really even more imperative to prioritize accessibility and inclusivity in research methods and research practices. And so I remind you, I wouldn't pretend that I'm introducing this to you, but I remind you of the research life cycle in human-centered research, which starts from defining the research question and question design or validation through bringing together the research team, through getting funding to do the work, through research governance, and then into creation and deployment of methodology. So making sure you go through ethics and consent and data collection approaches and recruitment, and then recruiting research participants, collecting data, analyzing and interpreting the data, and then knowledge mobilization, right? And so accessibility, I'm going to argue with you, is critical to this entire process, and it's critical to research integrity as a whole, critical to the responsible conduct of research as a whole. And there are a number of barriers to the inclusion of persons with disabilities within this space. For example, there are systemic and practical barriers that limit inclusive research. There is exclusion of disabled participants and researchers from design and analysis, inaccessible research protocols, materials and data collection tools and platforms. So that includes applications and research ethics, and we'll come back to that. Lack of understanding of disability communities and accessibility needs, a failure to plan for or fund accessibility supports and assistive technologies, and institutional policies that do not consistently support inclusion. Other barriers to inclusion of persons with disabilities in research include limited training of researchers in accessibility and inclusive methods, overprotective exclusions based on capacity assumptions, biases in peer review and assessment processes, budget constraints for accessibility supports, time pressures and institutional resistance to change, underrepresentation of disabled voices in research leadership, and research methods often will exclude non-dominant data, treating variability as error or irrelevant rather than as insight. And so when we actually think about where all of this comes from, and what I just showed you is the result of a really deep literature scan that we did earlier this year. But when we actually think about where all of this comes from, we actually have to go back historically to the dawn of research ethics. and how research ethics frameworks arose from the need for proper guidance around human clinical trials, particularly in the context of, say, cancer treatments, in and around World War II and just post World War II. So we're talking about the 1940s, 80 years ago, right? We also have to actually think about what was going on just prior to that, when the field of genetics was first being born, and how genetics and evolution gave rise to a little bit of an illegitimate stepchild, which for a long time was actually a very legitimate stepchild, and that was principles of eugenics. And so there were hidden principles of deficits in eugenics in research ethics processes and practices, particularly as related to persons with disabilities. And this manifested in terms of how we talk about vulnerable populations, so the language we're using, the terminology we use, and the conceptual framework around the engagement of persons with disabilities. And again, at the time that the research ethics framework was being developed, we were in a very different world at a very different point in time in history, where persons with disabilities were, not afforded the same kinds of opportunities in society as we are today. And so a lot of that ancestral language was sort of baked into how research ethics really got developed. And a lot of those barriers are intersecting and arise from colonialist, ableist, and racist framings of Western research methodologies. So I'm going to quote Emilio Alarcon, one of your colleagues from the University of Ottawa, when I say that we can't talk about best practices when the research system is actually not set up to recognize the personhood of persons with disabilities. We do have an ethical imperative for inclusion today, particularly through, for example, the TCPS, the Tri-Council Policy Statement on Ethical Conduct for Research Involving Humans, is updated in 2022. TCPS 2 affirms that inclusion is essential to ethical, high quality, and generalizable research. Inappropriate exclusion undermines the validity and utility of research findings. And all research stakeholders then create and present barriers to engagement in research, often unconsciously, and that's what we're here to think about and talk through. Um, and so researchers, research organizations, research funders, and the knowledge mobilization ecosystem all will interact with one another to foster and maintain and propagate in entirely unintentional ways barriers to engagement of persons with disabilities in research. So let's define a barrier for a moment, because it's important to do this. A barrier is an aspect of one's environment that blocks full participation. When we think about these barriers, as I said before, we tend to think about them through the person autonomous mindset, the intrinsic way of thinking about a barrier. Imagine that, though, as the tip of an iceberg, and so that's the personal experience, the individual's experience of a barrier. But the 90% of the iceberg that's underneath water is actually um, the systemic environment, the systemic barrier that, when I interact with that barrier as a person, actually gives rise to my own lived experience. And so it's the interaction again between the person and the environment. And so that personal barrier that manifests as the above the waterline 10% of the iceberg actually comes from and is nurtured by the 90% that's underneath the waterline, which is the systemic barrier. The water that nurtures that iceberg is 2 degrees Celsius in temperature, and so that is the system of assumptions that get baked into how we actually design things, as a community within the scientific research enterprise. And so that's where unconscious ableist assumptions will actually get baked into the system, and that's what we're here to unpack and talk about. And so just to define a couple of terms with you, ableism actually means the actively centering of one's ability to do a task or tasks in someone's mindset. And so when we think about the consent process, for example, the way that the consent process is framed, the way that a lot of consent language is sorted out, the way we define inclusion exclusion criteria, a lot of those are centered around ability to do something. And I'll give you a couple of examples later. And so they are covertly discriminatory. They're in fact ableist. Disableism, which isn't something that a lot of people will actually acknowledge being part of their mindset, is the active marginalizing or deprioritizing of the lived experience of persons with disabilities. So um, you can't do this because you're a person with a disability and persons with disabilities can't do this. That's discriminatory. So that's disableism, but saying that if you are not able to do X, you can't participate in Y, that's actually ableism, right? But you can't participate in Y because you're a person with a disability, that's disableism, right? So that's the difference between overt and covert discrimination. I do want to tell you a couple of stories because I think it's actually really important for you to understand that when we talk about research ethics gone awry, these things can happen. They do happen, but they're not necessarily actually recognized as happening. So these are things that actually happened to research teams that I was running. And so someone came to us with a study that was approved by a research ethics board. It was a disability focused study on assistive technology in aging adults, which used an institutionally mandated survey platform but wasn't accessible. So the researchers who had come to my research team had said, we want to collaborate with you on collecting data. On assistive technology in aging adults, but we're going to use a survey that's not accessible to do this. And so my team actually worked with the study team to recommend the use of a different survey platform. We had to fight research ethics a little bit on that. We ultimately tested the accessibility of the survey in the new platform for our collaborators and successfully disseminated the survey to the disability community. Another example that's very similar to that one, my team was approached with respect to a disability focused study on wayfinding in the disability community. And the REB mandated an institutionally approved, completely inaccessible survey platform from a different university. And again, we worked with the study team. We recommended the use of a different platform. We tested the accessibility of the survey and the new platform, and we successfully disseminated the survey. But then we actually had to go back to research ethics because research ethics was a little bit more recalcitrant in this case. And we had to say to them, working with the collaborator, look, this is not practical. You cannot do a disability focused study using an inaccessible survey platform. So either you deal with the platform or we find workarounds. And either way, you've actually got to recognize that this isn't going to work the way that the way that your rules say that it should. And that actually was a very hard conversation because that particular REB was much more resistant to contemplating change. Here's another example. This one actually happened during COVID-19. My team was actually approached to to share a study that had to do. It was a large national study that had to do with the impact of COVID-19 on work experiences. Um, the Research Ethics Board from yet another university had approved that study, but they refused to permit collecting information on disability demographics because that was considered to be too invasive and verging on collecting personal health information. And so they were concerned that the researchers were asking for things that were too detailed and too specific. Unfortunately, because there was no disability demographic in the survey and because the ethics board had said you can't put one in there, we couldn't distribute the survey and actually get any useful data out of it as a collaboration because we couldn't do any meaningful disaggregation and we couldn't do any meaningful interpretation. We did offer to work with the PIs for that study to deploy a disability specific version of the instrument. Unfortunately, because of COVID-19, that didn't actually happen. There was another case from actually the same university as the previous example, where the Research Ethics Board had approved a study to use electric shocks to one's facial muscles as a means to facilitate wayfinding and navigation of persons with vision loss, based upon preliminary data from two blindfolded sighted participants who actually happened to be the PhD student and their supervisor. Um, and so these researchers came to my research team looking to collaborate with us on this project, and the science here was suspect at best. But impressively, the REB had actually approved it, and we simply said no. So in all of this, what I want to point out is there's often a balance of barriers. There's what the research team needs and what the research ethics board or institutional research board um, uh, kind of requires. And so there's that tension between sort of what the organization has as rules and what the research team might need. Um, for the research team, there's two issues at play. One issue is usually a lack of understanding of the disability community, a lack of understanding of disability issues, a lack of understanding of some of the nuances around disability, accessibility, assistive technology, and so on. And then the other issue at play is, okay, the research ethics board has said I can't do something. Can I question that decision? Right? Is it my place to question that decision and push back on them because I think it needs to be done? Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to do it, but I don't really know. Right? For the REB, there's a little bit of the same issue. There's often a lack of understanding of community issues and disability focused science, and there is sort of that strict adherence to these rules apply, and they have to apply to everybody. And so my previous team actually decided that we would tackle this issue by doing an audit of research ethics platforms and research ethics applications. We created an online tool to assess the accessibility of ethics applications and websites. So the audit tool itself was an Excel spreadsheet with accessibility-based questions that covered a number of domains. There were, I think, 10 domains covered, for example, compensation, consent, risks, protection, and so on. And so we were able to do, yes, this was addressed, no, this was not addressed, or no, we could not assess it. We collected data for 28 academic institutions across Canada using this tool. 9 of those were medical doctoral universities, 6 were universities with large graduate faculties. 5 were primarily undergraduate universities, 8 colleges, 1 community research ethics board. And so this was about 12.3%, so about 1 in 8 of all schools in Canada, because there's 227 post-secondary institutions in Canada. There were 63 dimensions of assessment across 10 domains: general, platform, um, questions asked of the PI and the research team, research participants, compensation and reimbursement, recruitment, inclusivity of language, consent, privacy, risk, dissemination and knowledge sharing, and inclusion-exclusion criteria. I'll cut straight to the chase. The average score was a whopping 20%, 12.8 out of 63. So that was a mean standard deviation plus or minus 5.7. The median score was 12.5. The lowest score to 2, the highest score to 24 out of 63, right? And frankly, it didn't matter whether you were a college or a primarily undergraduate institution or a comprehensive university or a medical doctoral university or a community research ethics board. For all intents and purposes, nobody did well, right? Most folks were scoring between a 6 and a 15 out of a 63, and so less than 25%. In terms of the domains, we actually flagged that folks were receiving 0 scores. So REBs assessed were receiving 0 scores, predominantly in the section on research participants, the section on recruitment, the section on inclusivity and language, the section on consent, and the section on inclusion-exclusion criteria. So not great overall. Institutional research ethics platforms are consistently inaccessible to researchers. They don't tend to consider disability and accessibility in the way that the applications are structured. And research ethics applications also consistently position persons with disabilities as part of a vulnerable population, which is a deficit model, exclusionary, and so language and consideration. So a deficit model, exclusionary language and consideration are used to include persons with disabilities as research participants. They're also not considered to be part of the research team in research ethics processes at all. So unfortunately, no research ethics board that we assess does accessibility well. And that's a problem because there's significant room for error in developing, reviewing, and approving disability-focused research studies. And so we think about that. What could that look like? That could look like research ethics board policies on inclusion of research ethics participants with disabilities. It could look like facilitating researchers to think about inclusion exclusion of the disability community in human-centered research. It could look like technical accessibility of the site and forums. Let's zero in on consent a little bit because we've talked about ethics and what needs to be modernized there. Let's actually pay specific attention to consent. The consent process creates barriers for persons with disabilities in at least six ways. Number one, the language that's in use. Number two, sort of that notion of unaided participation. Number three, language and cognition. Related to both of those two things is how consent processes will often center the ability to do something as part of the consent inclusion-exclusion criteria. Accessible format, which is, I will cheerfully say, the one area where universities and colleges do tend to get this correct. They will sort of allow for in the research ethics process consent forms in different accessible formats. But that addresses the form, it doesn't address the function. And then the last issue is the issue of signatures. So just a piece on the technical language for a moment. Consent speaks to the right to privacy. It speaks to the right to confidentiality. It speaks to researcher abuse of power, or harassment or discrimination, and it speaks to data use. And so the reason that consent is as complex as it is because it goes to great pains to set out the rights of the research participant. The problem is that it does this in densely written, often very technical or legalese kind of language. There are a couple of solutions to this. One solution is using the recently published plain language standard from Accessibility Standards Canada. Open collaboration for cognitive accessibility based at the University of Ottawa has done work within this space around research consent as well to create plain language research consents, right? So using plain language approaches to make sure that technical, densely written language is language that everyone can interact with and relates to. There is another solution, which is more of a practice solution than a process or policy solution, and that's where you provide the consent ahead of time, and you narrate and describe the consent documentation in real-time data collection with all participants, not just persons with disabilities. The issue of unaided participation is another key barrier, and in this particular case, we have an expectation of persons with disabilities who engage in the research process to do so in an independent manner, in a manner where one is self-reliant and one does not actually need another person to be there to act in concert with them or sort of act on their behalf, right? And here we sort of run into or we encounter kind of the issue of what's acting on someone's behalf versus what is providing an accessibility support or aid. And so, for example, if somebody requires a communication support like an oral interpreter, then there's sort of that concern on the part of the researcher that the oral interpreter is speaking on behalf of, and it's not the voice of the actual research participant. I mean, one solution to this is that researchers will actually bake in accessibility supports like PSWs or sign language interpretation or captioning or communication supports or wayfinding supports or what have you into the data collection approach that's being designed. And so then you're not asking someone to bring someone with them. You're providing the person that is providing the accessibility support. That way, because there isn't a pre-existing relationship between the research participant and their support person, there's perhaps less of a concern that you are having a scenario where someone is acting on your behalf as opposed to doing something independently. Obviously, the thing with this is it requires researchers to think through accessibility support mechanisms in advance. And it also requires ethics boards and funders to put systems in place that will actually encourage or mandate, if you will, that level of assessment by researchers. And so researchers don't know what they don't know. I've seen enough scenarios where persons with disabilities get excluded from research studies because the researcher doesn't actually know how to include them. And this is one way to actually sort of force the issue around, well, as a researcher, you have to think about how you do this, because if you don't do this, are you actually undercutting the validity of your research question, or are you deliberately, or sorry, are you inadvertently narrowly scoping what you're doing, and will that actually create a barrier for you? Language and cognition is another major barrier. So there's a minimum requirement to understand questions and communicate with the research team. So the ability to speak the language used by the research team is actually taken as a proxy for cognition, understanding, and communication. But what about speech disabilities in a case like that? What about English language learners in a case like that? There's also really interesting things around the intersection among hearing loss, vision loss, and cognitive decline. And so you think about folks who might need to participate in studies around cognition, and are you actually sort of deliberately narrowing the scope of studies around cognition because you're emphasizing folks whose cognitive decline actually isn't as significant, and so you're biasing your results because you don't get folks whose cognitive decline is more significant, because the way the consent is set up, they actually won't be able to enroll in the study. Um, and so I think it becomes really important here to look at the cognitive disabilities literature. There's a lot been done in the cognitive disabilities space, both in terms of developmental disabilities and also in terms of aging and cognition, on uh, how to navigate cognition as part of consent. But it's also really important to divorce our thinking of understanding and communication from our thinking about language. And this isn't just a research issue, it's an education issue, this is an employment issue, this is an issue throughout, where we have sort of two sensory biases as a society. One is the bias toward vision, the bias toward sight, because 83% of our sense information comes through our eyes. But the other is how we communicate, and our bias is if we can't verbalize, um, then we're not really understanding, right? And we've sort of figured out how to deal with that bias with respect to sign language interpretation, but we haven't figured out how to deal with that bias with respect to, say, augmentative communication technologies. Because if someone's using augmentative communication technologies, or they're using a support person to communicate, sort of for them, using their words, often the pushback is, well, those aren't your words; those are the words of the communication support person. The other one I think I want to highlight is signature. I won't touch the accessible format piece because, as I say, that's the one that historically we've figured out how to do well in the context of research ethics. But signature, we've had for a long time a requirement for wet signatures, which of course is not accessible to folks with vision loss or with dexterity disabilities. During COVID, we had solutions for this all across the board, where we were actually considering alternative approaches to collecting signatures, and those are things that we need to continue to lean into in the post-COVID timeframe. So the other thing I would actually just comment on is systemic solutions within this space. That accessibility must be intentional. That without proactive design, disabled participants and disabled researchers are often excluded, which is especially problematic in non-dominant or small sample data sets. And so accessibility has to be embedded throughout the entire research life cycle that I showed you in the beginning. There are spaces of parallel practice that we can look at and think about in this context. Certainly in the context of Indigenous community engagement in research, and also in the context of CIHR strategy for patient-oriented research. There's lots of best practices within some of those spaces that will work in the context of disability and accessibility, and a burgeoning literature within the space that we've unpacked and summarized and thought through with respect to inclusion as it relates to research ethics and consent. So we've got about 14 minutes for a conversation. To connect with us and stay in touch with us, do flash the QR code that's on the screen. That will get you our contact information and our LinkedIn and socials, or you can flash this QR code, which will get you to access our form to get on our community mailing list. And so with that, I'm happy to stop and take conversation from the group.
Thank you very much, Mahadeo. Well, let's open up the floor. Is there anyone that has a specific question? And maybe when you speak, you could please give your name and then ask the question. Kelly, did you want to ask a question?
No, I was just signaling that the microphone would be accessible, but that was a very good presentation. Thank you. And thank you, Kate, for sending me the link.
Okay, thank you. Well, maybe I could start us off as a question. So, I mean, oh, actually, there's someone else. I will ask my question after. Go ahead, Dawn.
Hi there. My name is Dawn Richards. I guess I'm here today on behalf of an organization called Clinical Trials Ontario. And I really wanted to thank you for your talk. I think it's really, really helpful for a number of people. One thing I wanted to ask you, Mahadeo, is um, what kind of responses do you have to people when they maybe push back about some of what you've talked about in terms of that's going to take us too long, that's going to cost us too much money? I'm sure you've got all kinds of excellent evidence that you can cite about why that's not the case, but I wonder what else you have to offer as well.
Um, I think so I'll go to one extreme and then come back in a different direction. I think if folks are going to say we don't have the research budget for it, it wasn't included in the proposal, I'm sorry we can't do this, and it's just not practical, right? Like it's just not practical. Can't do it. My response to that is a piece of advice, which is when you write your paper, make it clear what your scope of limitations actually are, right? Because you do not wish a scenario where somebody reads your paper and you say nothing. And so people kind of infer positivity where no positivity exists. But you also want to be careful about exactly how you phrase your limitations. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, CADIS, the entity that approves that does regulation of drugs and therapeutic devices in Canada. They approved a device. I think it had to do with diabetes monitoring for use within the population of folks experiencing diabetes. And the approval note actually said this device is not safe for persons with vision loss to use. And they cited a reference for that. And when I dug at the reference, what the reference actually said was nothing of the sort. It didn't say this device is not safe for persons with vision loss to use. It said we never actually tested this device with persons with vision loss. And you had to find that in the supplemental methods because it also said, well, we didn't know how to test it because we didn't know how to make an accessible survey. And so in the publication, the researchers came straight out and said, we don't know how to do something, so we didn't do it, right? So good on them. That was great. But then how that actually gets concatenated out and how it gets translated into secondary reviews or how it gets translated into policy positions, that becomes a bit of a challenge. So if somebody basically says, I'm sorry, I really don't have the money, and and it doesn't exist, we don't have it in the budget, I can't do this thing, then you need to just declare that you can't do the thing, right? Now for folks who say this and probably actually do have the money, then I think my pushback would be, well, why can't you do the thing? Can you explain to me exactly what the barrier is? Is it really money? Is it really time? Is it lack of expertise? Is it the lack of resources to pay third-party expertise? Like what is the actual problem, right? What is the conceptual barrier or the practical barrier that is stopping you from including persons with disabilities in your research? And I think at that point it becomes, Dawn, more of a coaching conversation, um, because I find that what will end up happening is people will kind of just think about stuff through that disability as a health outcome lens, as opposed to disability means that this person's an actual participant in my study kind of thing, right? I'm here
Mm-hmm.
to help you. I'm not here to involve you. Is kind of that age-old default thinking, that then you need to sort of unpack and say, okay, well, that's your perspective. Why are you holding that opinion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's not about the million ways I could point out they're wrong. It's actually about the million ways I can nudge them toward doing the right thing.
Okay, great. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you for the question.
Ellie, did you want to ask a question?
No, I think it was very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll ask my question then. Um,
Please.
so, I mean, you mentioned you mentioned that you were in front of the parliamentary committee that's looking at science, and I think there's a movement to, like the country south of us, to say that DEI isn't important to science. And so my question is kind of like, yeah, my question is, how do you build empathy or interest among people that don't see this at all as a priority? And one of the ways that I've seen that come through, and you mentioned it as well, was, someone's doing a population study on it could be in the brain heart conditions. And they say, well, we're not looking at specific subpopulations, we're looking at the population as a whole. And they deprioritize, looking at disaggregated data. Yeah, so my question is, what do you do in these? Do you have any recommendations for how you kind of address those challenges?
So I think it's a great question, Kate, and my answer to the question sort of comes through that lens of, okay, so by deprioritizing specific populations, because you're trying to get an answer to a question at the population as a whole level, are you concerned that the different variables that you're not actually tracking are going to, shall we say, hide differences within your population? So let's say you don't bother tracking biological sex, right? But there's clearly a biological sex difference um, between a brain phenotype in males or a brain phenotype in females, or a heart phenotype in males versus a heart phenotype in females. And so if you just do the overall population, you end up getting a numerical average that makes no sense, because the average for males and the average for females is actually quite different, right? If you're interested in doing something from a neurology perspective, and you're not, for example, thinking about acquired brain injury, right? Then what ends up happening is you're going to get an artificial sense of what's going on in the population, and you've actually hidden a whole bunch of things because you're not looking at the subpopulations that you actually have available to you, right? And so that is a form of bias in data analysis. Right. And so I would actually come at the conversation through the lens of, what sources of bias are you inadvertently introducing by not collecting data that might mean that you mitigate that source of bias?
So it's, sorry, just to respond. So it's throwing back to them the risks that they're taking in not accounting for the fact that there are these differences, and if you just you know gaze over them or ignore them, they're I mean, you've said it, right? Your data is not generalizable.
No, it's not. And I think if you're aware that your data are not going to be generalizable, then go ahead and declare that your data are not generalizable. I'm willing to bet that somebody somewhere is going to call that out when they see your paper and you try to publish it, and they say to you, "Why didn't you collect this?" Because it's useful information, and so you missed the boat, right? I so what I would also say, Kate, is like this isn't a conversation about providing reasonable accommodations to research participants because research participants need reasonable accommodations to participate in the study. This is a conversation about um, if you've got a question that has to do with the human condition, um, and part of that human condition is disability, right? Then by deliberately weeding out or accidentally weeding out up to 27% of the population, or perhaps even more than that, then are you actually answering the question that you set out to ask? Right? Take some of those examples that I shared. So if you've got a research study that focuses on aging in place and you're looking at assistive technology use for aging adults, and aging adults who use assistive technology can't take the survey, then you're not going to get the data you need to make the recommendations that you need to change the policies that you want to change, right? And
Yeah.
so I think when we come at the conversation through the lens of are you actually doing the thing you want to do as a researcher, as a scientist, right? Then it becomes a different issue. It's not the issue of, oh, well, I need reasonable accommodations. I don't want to do that because I don't believe we should do DEI, right? That's a different conversation entirely.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We only have 1 minute left. Is there anyone that has another short burning question or comment?
If not, this was lots of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mahadeo. It's been a real pleasure. And it was a great overview with lots of concrete examples, very interesting. And I think we have your QR codes to get more information. And yeah, there's people applauding and saying a big thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.